Today we'll be discussing stand-up comedy styles, and we'll be discussing sleep apnea. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today we'll be discussing different types of comedy styles, and then we'll be discussing sleep apnea.
By the way, they are unrelated. We should mention that, huh? Your comedy style does not lead to sleep apnea.
As far as we know.
Unless, yeah, exactly. I haven't done all the research. Anecdotally speaking, there is no connection between comedy stylings, or wearing a big mask on your face to sleep at night. Well, we'll talk about that more very soon.
By the way, let people know I got a new microphone for our recording.
A new sleep apnea machine. Yes, congratulations on the microphone.
Hoping that it results in a richer sound. Let us know what you guys think, if you think there was a big difference from the old episodes to this one.
I know personally you're less rich because of the microphone, but
expensive.
The sound, I think it's noticeable.
I love it when people think we make money from the podcast. They're like, oh, you're making some extra money. Are you kidding? This is a money-losing venture. But anyway.
Don't tell people that, Asif. This is a passion project. That's the way you say it. It's a passion project. It's all about the way you spin these things, fella.
Okay, Ali, I want to talk to you about comedy styles, getting back to some questions about the art of stand-up comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as we've talked about on the podcast several times, you teach a class at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario on stand-up comedy. So I want to ask you a bit about that. How do you approach this idea of introducing different comedy styles to your, audience? They are an audience. Your students is what I meant.
They are an audience, but they are more than anything students and people who enjoy stand-up comedy at some level. Not all of them. Sometimes I'm like, why did you take this class and who's your favorite stand-up comedian? And the answer is, I don't know and I don't have one. And they're like, oh. And then they drop the class a month later. But not always. Sometimes they're like, I'm sticking to this because I've been introduced to something I like. I like this world. Also, sometimes, there's a lot of students from the drama department and it feels like a skill that can complement the skills they already have in place. Sometimes it's an engineering student or a poli-sci student, and it's like, I need this one
Wow, it's like an elective for them.
Yeah, and it's like, it does great things for my brain and my stress level, and it's a nice balance. So, there's no way to kind of tell someone, this is the style you should be using, right? Comedy styles are very much the choice. It's a very, very personal choice, how you want to stand up on stage and address people, how you feel the most comfortable doing it. And I think we've talked, basically about this before, but there, broadly speaking, there's three types of comedy. There's stand-up, there's sketch, there's improv. This is the way we look at the types of comedy. But the styles of comedy, and I'm going to focus just on stand-up. I don't know the world of sketch or improv that well, where I can speak about it knowledgeably. Improv in particular has a very, very long, rich history, which we should actually talk about. I will probably ask a friend in the improv community to either join us or feed me a lot of information. But there are some real OGs in the improv world who helped shape this entire, short form, long form improv, and people who love SNL. I'm sure, that's the greatest sketch comedy out there. I know people are like, it's not what it used to be, but it's been around since 1975. It is something.
And you have some friends who've done sketch comedy, been very successful doing sketch comedy. So maybe we could pull some of those strings and get. We're going to do that.
On. Let's take a note of that so that we don't make empty promises. But right now
someone make a note of that.
Yeah, someone make a note of that, please. Oh, that's right. Can't afford an assistant. One day soon. So stand-up is my area of interest and I would say expertise, with quotes on it. And it's a weird one, it's like a strange entertainment vehicle to begin with. You don't really have any plot or backstory or narrative. As I've told people, like writing the book, my editor would be like, okay, this is a great story you shared with me. Why are you telling this story? And I found that so difficult to answer. I was like, man, why are you even asking me that? Like, that doesn't factor in. For a stand-up comic, I don't need to know why I'm telling a story. I just tell it. And stand-up can just be like, so I saw this guy the other day on the street, and boom, you're into the story. That's it. That's all you need. You don't need a whole bunch of anything, compared to so many other different mediums. So it's a weird one, but at the end of the day, you're a comedian entertaining an audience, and that audience laughs. Or they don't, but the goal is obviously to make them laugh and to be entertained. So, if you look up the types of stand-up, there's a lot. And I think it's a little bit too niche for my liking when people talk about, there's, comedians who are self-deprecating. There's the self-deprecating style. There's the alt comics. There's the observational, deadpan, improv, who do crowd work type of thing. There's wordplay comedians. I think there's just so much overlap there. That's sort of hyper focusing on those comedians. So,
in medicine, we have this term called lumpers versus splitters. Have you ever heard of this term?
No, maybe it's just no, but I love it already.
And it is basically, do you want to put everything together? So in other words, say we're going to talk about sleep disorders, put all the sleep disorders together and then call that sleep disorders, and sleep apnea is one of them. Sleepwalking is another. Night terrors are another. REM behavior disorder is another. Or do you split them off? And then the problem is, how much do you split it? There's obstructive sleep apnea, central sleep apnea, mixed sleep apnea, and how much do you kind of like differentiate those things? So you're more in favor of just lumping things together, right? As opposed to being
I'm a lumper, I suppose. As unflattering as that sounds, I might be more of a lumper. I mean, look, I'm going to focus on a few different types, which I find, stand out in particular. I will tell you this story, just getting back to, your original question, which was about my students. I introduce them to a bunch of styles, and I do that in the interest of showing them, like, don't hesitate to be the person who either tells something completely from their own life, one story, or has a number of jokes that are observational, or does a character, or does a deep dive on one subject. And, that's the entire 5-minute set that they do for their final. One of my students memorably became very concerned about, he was asking me, sir, are you going to film this? And I thought he was asking if I'm going to film their final for their benefit, because they'd like to watch it later. And I said, I'm not going to film it. I'm going to do an audio recording, but you're free to film your own sets. And he said, oh, so somebody else might be filming it. I go, yeah, you can find out whoever's filming. You can ask them to film you too. He said, actually, I'm not asking that. I'm hoping nobody films it. I'm a little bit worried about 5 years, 10 years from now, the stuff I'm saying, if it's ever taken out of context, how it'll look. And so I was like, oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. I didn't think you were coming from that angle, but I think it is important to believe in your point of view. Whether you believe it or not, it's very important to appear that you believe in your point of view. Whether it's your character's point of view or your actual point of view, or something you want people to believe in the interest of then, thereby shocking them or, confusing them or giving them a little bit of the hard left turn at the end and surprising them. So he's like, okay. And this was like, 2 weeks to the final. He's like, I don't know, some of these things I'm saying, it could be misinterpreted as something or the other. And he came up with this on his own. He said, okay, what do you think about, I'm not going to scrap all my jokes. I'm instead going to create a character. And he's the one student I have who did it. And I thought it was very interesting. He came on stage and he was like, yeah, so I've been noticing a few things. And he was this weird sort of, elderly, I don't even know exactly what his character, but it was like nebbish, elderly weirdo type of thing. The way he held his, so in a way he did that to kind of protect himself, and yeah, it was pretty interesting to watch. And he delivered all his lines very confidently, and he was no longer worried about, like, will this be taken out of context? Because it's like, you see, it's in a certain context. I created this character and I don't believe those things. The character does. So all that to say, here are a few stand-up comedy styles that I think are of particular interest. Like, for example, if I was going to send someone to a comedy show, I'd probably tell them if they were one of these type of stand-up comics. I'm not going to tell somebody like, oh, this person uses wordplay. You'll love, like,
what does
that's
that
too
even
niche
mean?
for me. I do think that there's some value in telling people when it's a one-liner comic. It's a very interesting style. One-liners, can you think of any one-liner comics, Asif? There will be quizzes, so pay attention.
Yeah, I usually say Emo Phillips is probably the one I think of the most. Yeah.
Emo Phillips is a great example. He has a joke, just to give you an idea of what a one-liner comic does. And now I'll leave you with the last words of my grandfather. A truck. That's it. That's a joke. I mean, that doesn't even take 10 seconds. So the one-liner comedians, the brilliance of these guys are not just how funny their jokes are, but also how many jokes they tell. I mean, in a 45-minute or 30-minute headlining set, you could be looking at, 60, 70, 100 jokes. It is a crazy amount of stuff to keep up in your mind. So generally, I regard these guys as quite brilliant. So the other guys who come to mind, Mitch Hedberg, right? Mitch Hedberg, one of the greatest one-liner comics, also very short jokes. I saw this wino the other day eating a grape, and I was like, dude, you got to wait. Right? So that's it. That's the whole joke. There's the whole joke. And now a lot of comics are like, I gotta stretch this joke out. And he's just like, no, I'm just going to keep writing more and more. And one of the greatest is Stephen Wright. And Stephen Wright, if you don't know who that is, comedian out of Boston originally, sort of like had the real weirdo persona, really one of the best out there.
Deadpan as well. Like that.
Deadpan
he's
as well,
the example
right?
of Deadpan, I think.
He's an example of Deadpan. And again, Deadpan I find a little too niche to mention, but it is a deadpan one-liner delivery. So in his deadpan voice, he'd tell jokes like, God, I'd kill for a Nobel Peace Prize. Right? That's it. That's the whole joke. That's all he does. And it takes a while. Sometimes people roll in and then he's on to the next joke. And there's almost a comedy in how quickly he goes from one to the other. And without you really articulating it to yourself, you're kind of, as an audience, going like, what? Is that it? We're already on to the next, which is another layer of comedy on top of the comedy that he's actually doing as well. His look as well, his delivery as well. There's multiple layers of comedy happening at once. So one-liner comedians, I'm a big fan. Usually they're quite brilliant. And so that's worth mentioning. I think another one in the opposite sort of end of the spectrum is storytelling comedians. Because storytelling can be, I don't think it's for everybody. I don't think it's for everyone. I think a lot of people, I do a storytelling style in my solo shows, in my one-man show. And I think there's always a handful of people who will come up and be like, that was different, man. That was different. That's not what I'm used to seeing from you, right? They go out of their way to say that. So I know that some people register this as something inherently different. The goal is still to entertain. The goal is still to make people laugh. But also, in a solo show, in a one-man show, in a one-woman show, you can go places that you don't typically go in a comedy club. In a comedy club, you should be getting a laugh every 20 or 30 seconds, or there is a discernible discomfort that goes across the crowd, right? You usually have the word comedy right behind your shoulder on the stage, the name of the comedy club. And if you're at Chuckles, and there have been no Chuckles, people get very hyper aware of that. Whereas when you have 90 minutes on a stage to do whatever you want, you have some time to explore. And I really enjoy the format. And some of the greats in that department, Bill Burr, there's no short jokes for Bill Burr, especially now more than ever. Listening to one of his earlier specials, it's a little tighter and chopped up, but now it's like really long form. Obviously, Dave Chappelle, Margaret Cho comes to mind. Canadian guy who's one of the great storytellers here. I really like K. Trevor Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
Rick Mercer, of course, one of the best storytellers. The Irish, I cannot mention, the Tommy Tiernans of the world, Billy Connolly's of the world. He's Scottish, mind you, but people who come from real storytelling culture are always very, very impressive. Richard Pryor, although I saw Richard Pryor do many, many things, there was definitely an element of storytelling there as well. One of the greats. Obviously, I'll mention this as well. Another style of comedy is observational. One of your favorites, Asif.
Yeah, Jerry Seinfeld, I think, is the classic.
Right? He's the classic. I think Chris Rock also. This is a lot of sort of like, you ever notice how blah, 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 what's the deal with, with is the trope of it all?
Yeah.
But Yeah, it's like what's happening there is you're not necessarily learning anything about the person themselves, right? Like any Jerry Seinfeld set I've seen, I have not heard him talk about his children. He has a number of children. He has a wife who he loves very much from, as I've seen from interviews, a wonderful relationship with this woman who he met later in life. Doesn't talk about them. Now, you correct me if I'm wrong, because you've seen more Jerry Seinfeld.
Yeah,
You've seen
no,
him live.
exactly. He will talk about them in the abstract. When you have kids and they're doing this, or,
Yeah.
When your wife wants to do this, he's not being specific about my wife did this and she did this.
Yeah.
Rarely he does, but that's not usually the situation. So much so that if he's telling you an example of a kid, you're not even sure if it's his kid or he's just using this as fodder for jokes. So,
and that's why Chris Rock is almost in quotes in this, because Chris Rock, especially in Tambourine, his special, the last special, you learn a lot more about Chris Rock. There's a lot more personal stuff that comes up. But originally it was this like fantastic observations on society that, people still remember to this day. The other thing I would probably tell somebody if they were going to a comedy club, I would say that this person does a character. If people do characters, I think that's worth mentioning. So a character, we've talked about this on a previous episode where we talked about personas, comedic personas. It was an episode where we also talked about burnout in the medical community. The characters are like, for example, Andrew, the Dice Man, Clay, right? Bobcat Goldthwait,
right.
Larry the Cable Guy. These are people who completely embody somebody else that has nothing to do with them as a human being. In fact, it's often a completely different persona. I don't know if that's the case with Andrew Dice Clay, but with some of these other guys, it's a completely fictitious character. I have a friend in Canada who plays a character. I'm not going to mention his name because people don't all know that it's a character, and it gets a little disappointing for people to find out, like, oh my God, that's a character. But one of my close buddies plays one of these characters. And of course, the danger always is, how do you get out of this character? I guess I'm stuck doing this forever. But if you like the character, that's great. Dave Hempstead is a friend of mine, stand-up comedian. He used to do a cowboy character. So he was informed by some of his own personal experiences. He lived in Missouri for a couple of years. He was on a golf scholarship in Missouri. Then he was in some other Midwestern state. But yeah, he would put on a cowboy hat and he would do this character. This was before I came to Toronto, so I never saw it, but I hear great things. But Dave stepped out of that and decided to shed the character and has had much success without the character. But it's not always that easy. Bobcat Goldthwait also succeeded. Not as much, I'd argue. People don't talk about him, but he's an incredibly intelligent human being, which the original character did not suggest. I think a lot of people are like, what? I don't hear intelligent Bobcat. This is weird. Your name's Bobcat, bro. The other few styles of comedy, I think shock and insult. It's worth telling people they're going to see an insult comic or a shock comic, right? You should know that before going in, before you tuck into the front row. Classically, right? Don Rickles was the original, I'm sure there was others more original than him, but Don Rickles maybe popularized it the most. He was an insult comic. Famously said he'll, open equal opportunity insulter and all that. There's much that's been written about how fair his insults really were. But anyway, his name definitely comes to mind. Joan Rivers had a little bit of that shock to her, right? She would say something and people would sort of gasp and laugh at the same time. And then she, oh, come on. Oh, please. Yeah. She would shock them and then pretend to be outraged about the shock that she herself created, right? That was the shtick a little bit. Again, Dice Man was purposefully, shocking. He tried to be. There's a number of other ones, I don't always enjoy. I don't know. I don't feel like all of it has aged well either.
Yeah, I know what you mean, because some of it I find is just shock for the sake of shocking. But is that funny or not? There's a bit of like, I think what's more funny is the outrageousness of a situation. That may be it. I think, I'm being a bit critical about Sarah Silverman. I think at the beginning, her comedy was, oh, can you believe a woman saying this? This crude stuff. I didn't find that funny. And I think she's evolved over time and it's not, that's not her style anymore. And I think it's a bit more nuanced. It's funny, I pulled up the Wikipedia entry as we were preparing for this episode on shock comedy. Not a lot of detail, but they said Andrew Dice Clay. Then they included people like Tom Green and Eric Andre. I want to
Hmm.
get your thoughts on that. Do you think
Oh,
that that's
100%.
yeah, okay.
100%. I think Tom Green would go out of his way to do ridiculous things, have a horse's head in his parents' bed as they wake up and see it or whatever it was. You know what I mean? He was like all about pranks that were above and beyond the average pranks
Yeah,
and
I guess
shocking people.
I separate these things because another example that this Wikipedia entry gives is Jackass or the Ali G show. I think there's a difference between trying to do something to elicit a reaction out of shock and maybe that issue of vulgarity versus saying someone doing something on screen, and Tom Green is a good example, that is so outrageous you can't believe this is going on. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? I think there's a difference. I prefer the latter. I think that's funny and kind of outrageous. Like that's the word. Whereas the other one is like, what are you just trying to offend people? Do you know what I mean? The difference
Yeah.
between those two?
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure I
Sure.
would lump them all together, but whatever.
Yeah. Wikipedia doesn't care. They're a lumper. They're a lumper. I mean, I do know what you're saying. I remember Bobby Slayton, who is, he likes to be, outrageous. He's been the MC of the Nasty Show at Just for Laughs for many years, and I was on stage at this small bar. Bobby Slayton came in to do a little warm up set. Then my friend Abdul, his last name is Abdul Butt, he performed. Then Bobby came on, and Bobby was like, "Ali, Abdul, what the hell's going on? Is this a terrorist meeting or something?" Nobody laughed. To their credit, Montreal bar was like, "Well, that's not really funny at all." The only shock that night was how shocked Bobby Slayton was that his joke didn't go over
Yeah.
anywhere. Like, I think he's used to, no disrespect, but he's used to less educated American crowds in general. And I think people would have gotten a laugh from that in many different markets that he performs in. But yeah, I mean, it's just like being shocking or offensive or insulting for the sake of funny, and it doesn't always work. It doesn't always age well. But the two best who come to mind for me who do this sort of shocking, insulting. I've lumped those two together. I'm definitely a lumper in those. But as far as the insults go, and this is with a huge caveat, it's Jeff Ross, right? He's the roast master general, all the roasts, something that he started. But I encourage every single listener to look up Jeff Ross and listen to interviews with this guy. He's one of the kindest, sweetest human beings. He is always, you roast the ones you love is what and in many cases, comedy is offered without context. So if you see things Jeff Ross is doing, you'd be like, is that guy insulting a handicap guy? The handicap guy said, please roast me, right? People come and be like, I want this. I want this. And he says, he talks about how many people who have like facial deformities or some kind of like severe burns or severe disabilities will be like, can you roast me? And Jeff's like, this is tough. This is very difficult, but I'm going to do it. And it's people who are like, I just want to be seen as a human being. I want to be roasted just like everybody else. And I spend my life not being treated like a normal human being. And in a way, you're roasted. So it's this whole thing. It's worth listening to. It's worth exploring. I find what I've learned about this man, and I would say like 6 different interviews, one of the most kind-hearted people. His interview with Mark Maron is particularly of interest.
It's interesting because he's one of the people I've seen live, and I saw him about 50, I don't think I've told the story on the podcast, but Ollie knows the story. About 15 years ago, I was in New York City with my wife and my sister-in-law and brother-in-law. We went to go see a show, and my sister-in-law was happy. She's like, oh, Jeff Ross is the headliner. This is before Jeff Ross was really famous with roasting, roast battles,
Sure.
all that stuff.
Is that the night where somebody was high on drugs and got taken off stage?
Yeah, it was ridiculous.
That's not Jeff Ross, obviously.
It wasn't Jeff Ross, no, but somebody else. Like it was ridiculous. The MC did a good job, but I'm like, this is like a high-end comedy club, like Caroline's, I think, in New York City, like, one that's well known anyway. That's a whole other ridiculous story. But Jeff Ross was there, and my sister-in-law was like, yeah, he does a lot of jokes about celebrities, right? Because he was starting to get known as being the roasting guy.
Yeah.
But he didn't. He made fun of people in the audience. And I just didn't think it was that funny because I don't think at that stage of his career, people were going there hoping they would roast him.
Absolutely right. And that's a huge challenge when you're on a show with 6 other comics with different styles. Now
Right.
people are like, why is this guy being a
Yeah.
jerk to me? The last guy wasn't, the host
Yeah.
wasn't. Whereas when 1,000 people go to see Jeff Ross,
Right.
now it's a whole
That's
different
right.
thing.
That's right. And so
Yeah.
he's at a different level, and I can totally picture people being, "Oh, roast me like you roasted Trump or Justin Bieber. Just roast me like you did that." So I do think that he's at a bit of a different stage right now. But then you mentioned someone else.
Oh, and finally, as far as shock comics go, I think Anthony Jeselnik is worth looking up. Anthony Jeselnik has been doing this for a while. The first time I heard him, I said, pretty damn good, but this is not going to last. I mean, how much of this type of dark, shocking material stuff that people are like, I really shouldn't be laughing at this, but I am. How long can this go on? And he's, people first heard of him on a roast. Most people. I had known about him before just because comedy is my, it was my life even more so then than it is now. And so I'd seen him before do a shorter set and I liked it. But then he was on one of the roasts. I don't remember who it was, but he really, there's a few comics who come on those roasts and then it's just like a steady path upwards after that. Everyone's like, who is this person? I need to know who this person is. And he was like merciless and really like sizzling with his burns and in his roasting, and that's his comedy is very similar, and he's been quite great. I would recommend, if you have the stomach for it, if you're not easily offended, you go check out some of his earlier stuff and then work through to now. It's impressive how he stayed relevant and kept the same persona of a shock comic.
Just as we're wrapping up the comedy styles, what do you think about prop comics?
Yeah, so that's another one of my categories, but I'm a lumper, guilty as charged. Props, but also magic and music go in there as far as I'm concerned.
And ventriloquism you put in with those as well?
Ventriloquism I put in with something that's not comedy. No, I'm just joking. Ventriloquism I definitely put in there too. That is a prop. If you look, comedy originally was a person and a microphone on a stage. This was the entire thing. Anything you bring to enhance or complement, I think it's kind of a prop. Mm-hmm. And I don't look at props as a bad thing at all. I think sometimes people go prop comic. Do you know who's been looked at the most disparagingly?
Well, there's two.
Yeah.
In the past, it was Gallagher. It passed away recently last year. Yeah. But Carrot Top is the one that everyone...
Absolutely. People always use his name as disparagingly as possible. The way people use Dane Cook's name, it's rarely complimentary. But Carrot Top, this is supreme entertainer. Entertainer. Does he look insane these days? All jacked. Yes, up, but look, growing up with hair that red, who knows what happened to him. So, but he's a great entertainer. But let me quiz you on this. One of the greatest prop comedians, was huge in the 70s, still active today, but no longer as a stand-up comic. He would do music, he would do props, and he had a background in magic.
Steve Martin?
You got it. I had other clues. I didn't think you were going to get this. The music was the banjo.
I just remember the arrow, through the
arrow,
head,
the bunny ears. Yeah. I mean, that's a guy who I was like, oh, you just do whatever it takes to entertain people. Your goal is to entertain. So why would we judge somebody for bringing props and different things on stage? So I just don't. I never have. And when you talk about musical comedians, there's an interesting thing. If you watch Zach Galifianakis live at the Purple Onion, I think it is, Dimitri Martin, they're playing music, but the music is really not part of what's going on. Like all they're doing is telling jokes with a little bit of like piano melody or guitar. So you really only know you really have to know how to strum a few chords, and that's it. It just is a backdrop, like at a speakeasy, somebody just talking with a little bit of like melody in the back. Whereas other comedians, Adam Sandler, Craig Robinson,
yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah. Flight of the Conchords.
Oh, yeah, of
Jermaine, Brent, Garfunkel and Oates. I don't know if people know Kate Micucci and Ricky Lindome. Fantastic. Flo and Joan. Oh, my God. This is a duo. You got to look up. They're a British duo, sing a lot of musical comedy. Fantastic. Bo Burnham and Tim Minchin. I leave their names for the last. They're the best that I've seen. Tim Minchin in particular.
Yeah, Bo Burnham we've talked about before. I know his work.
Yeah.
Tim Minchin I never even heard of.
Tim Minchin I haven't seen in a long time. It's one of the greatest live acts I've ever seen. ever. Really phenomenal dude. And then, magic, I don't know if I have the patience for magic, but I've seen certain people do it in a way that's incredibly entertaining. Tell me, you have your hand up?
It's Penn and Teller. Like, that is
Penn
the
and Teller.
pinnacle of comedy magic. I can't even think of another example after them. I love Penn and Teller. I've seen them live. Maybe because it might be either diminishing returns or you're aping something that is already at the pinnacle, and it's hard to compete with Penn and Teller.
Sure.
They have the whole, one guy speaks, one guy doesn't. And again, I've seen them live. I've watched their TV shows. I have a huge respect for them. But are there others that you're thinking of?
Well, there's one guy, David Acker. David is a friend of mine. He co-owns the Comedy Nest in Montreal. And no matter who I'm talking to, what I'm doing, I will leave anything to go watch David on stage. It's always entertaining. It's a mix of, again, it's the Steve Martin thing, whatever I have on hand, tell some jokes, do some magic, do some tricks. But his tricks are also like, just to give you an idea of one of his, he's like, all right, now, miss, it is not appropriate to ask a woman her age, but what if I guessed your age? What would you think of that if I could just, with barely any information about you, know exactly what your age is? Okay. All right. And I only need one piece of information for you. What is the year of your birth? Right? So then this is like the way he does it. He just makes it like tricks that everybody can do. And then at the end, he'll do a card trick. And you're like, wait, what? Oh, this guy is super legit. This is insane. So it's just like always this incredible journey that he does. And I love watching him. And then the final type of comedy that I would be remiss to mention is political comedy. If somebody's going to a comedy show, I'm going to tell them it's a political comedian. Also, not too different from the one-liner comedians. When they're good, they're quite brilliant. They're quite brilliant. And, Jon Stewart comes to mind, obviously. John Oliver comes to mind. Rick Mercer comes to mind in this country. Bill Maher, I struggle to call him brilliant just because what a complete dick he is. But, I mean, he's around. Yeah. He's lasted. It's just very difficult to listen to a guy talk about cancel comedy has gone too far. I'm like, dude, you're on a huge network with the third or fourth television show you've ever had. You're not affected by this. What are you talking about? So it's a little bit of like a self-victimization shtick that he has. And then, of course, one of the best to ever do political comedy is George Carlin, and he got more political as the years went on and almost became prophetic in his approach, and it became less funny and a little bit too real. And it's stuff that still applies today, 30, 40 years later in many cases. So anyway, those are the various styles of comedy. If you were going to do stand-up comedy, only you know what you'd pick. But certainly if you have a magic background, a musical background, if you have an interest in politics, if you have, the knack of like insulting people or doing voices, all of that is worth using. And I think that's the message to students of stand-up comedy. Use what you have available to you. If you can do it confidently, absolutely use it, right? The Irish are natural storytellers, and so the comedy is storytelling. So whatever comes naturally to you. I remember watching this one comedian, it still kills me to this day that I didn't catch his name, but it was one Just for Laughs festival. I watched him do a 5-minute story, which is fantastic. Go to see him on another show. It's the same guy. I'm like, oh, this guy's going to tell this story. It's great. Now it's a 12-minute version. I'm like, oh, it's the same story. And then because of him, I went to the Irish comics show, whatever they call it, Just for Laughs back then, the Luck of the Irish. So it's this guy's on it again. And now he tells a 20-minute version of the same story. And it was as brilliant as the 5-minute. He just knew all the pacing, he had turned it into, that's where I first saw like the art of storytelling. Anyway. Those are the comedy styles. I hope that's been interesting. I hope some of these names are unfamiliar to you and you look them up and hopefully enjoy them.
Yeah, we'll list them on our website so people can check them out.
All right, Asif, let's talk about something that's been in the news a fair amount. And by in the news, I mean in the lives of more and more friends that I have. Sleep apnea. What is it? How do I not get it?
You may already have it.
Oh,
well, 50% of us on this podcast have it. And so we haven't actually done this very much, talked about our personal medical lives. Ali's hinted at it a bit. Certainly you've talked about your father who had some lung issues. So we have hinted at it, but I do have a type of sleep apnea, so I'll talk about it. So sleep apnea is basically this pausing or cessation of breathing when you're asleep. And there's two different forms. One is called central sleep apnea, one is called obstructive sleep apnea. So we're not going to be talking about the central form. That's a bit of a different situation. So just obstruction. So what happens is, in most people, when you're sleeping, you have some collapse of your upper airway structures. That will cause an obstruction of your breathing in and out, and that will cause you to either reduce your breathing, stop breathing, and that will result in decreased oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, right? Because we're not breathing out carbon dioxide, so it's staying in your blood, and usually arousing you from sleep. So basically your body eventually says, oh my gosh, you're kind of dying, so wake up and stop doing that, so that then you wake up. So that's why people will be tired, have an unrefreshing sleep, and of course snoring, because snoring is associated a lot with this collapse of the upper airway. So not all people who snore have sleep apnea, and you don't have to have snoring for sleep apnea, right? So either one is not necessarily true, but it's often correlated. So that's essentially what it is.
1 out of 2 of us have it for sure. Maybe 2 out of 2 of us. Maybe I'll find out more at the end of this. I do know that, my snoring is not consistent. I think it's connected to my weight. I think it's connected to late night drinking, eating. Just basic mistreatment of myself seems to result in more snoring. Could you have sleep apnea and never have been somebody who snores?
Yeah.
Or is that, okay. So
it's not always
they're not linked
associated.
that
Yeah,
way.
very important. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me how common it is in society, because I've definitely met more and more people, not met, these are my friends for many years, and keep finding out that they need the sleep apnea.
Yeah, it's the type of thing, like if it comes up in conversation over dinner, then you're like, one guy will say they have it, and then another guy says they do. Like,
yeah, nobody's opening with "Come see my mask." But I think more and more it does come up.
Yeah, I mean, it's I would say half the time, when you're out with people, at least 1 or 2 people is saying, if you actually ask them about it. So this is the problem, is a study done in Canada, I'll stick with Canadian studies for now, by the Public Health Agency of Canada, done several years ago, thought that 26% of Canadian adults reported symptoms and risk factors that will put them at a high risk of obstructive sleep apnea. So that's a quarter of the people surveyed. But if you look at actual people who've been diagnosed, it's only about 3% of Canadians age 18 and over who've been reported to have sleep apnea. So there's a discrepancy between people who might have it and people who are. So probably what that means is a lot of people are undiagnosed, or it's an underdiagnosed condition,
or unwilling to go get diagnosed.
Well, that's an interesting thing. Someone, I'll mention this now, someone who shall remain nameless, but everybody who knows me knows who I'm talking about, said, and I said to this person, yeah, you might have a sleep apnea based on your symptoms. Your wife is quite worried about you. And this person is like, I would rather die than have to wear one of those things. I'm never wearing that. Okay.
Unfortunately, you might just get your wish.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so what are the causes of sleep apnea? And are they things that are on the rise in society, or are they things that have always been around?
Well, one of them you kind of alluded to before, and that's your body mass index. So the more weight you have on your body, just the more weight you will have in this area in terms of the upper airway, and that can increase airway collapsibility. And you can get adipose tissue in your tongue, and again, the upper airway. It's been reported to be present in more than 40% of people with a BMI of more than 30. Again, we've talked about the limitations of BMI before on the podcast, but in general, that's what we would say. So definitely increased BMI, increased neck circumference. Those are risk factors. But it's very important to know there are some people who are of completely normal weight who have sleep apnea. In fact, a lot of people. So that
sounds like Asif's on the defensive and possibly talking about himself.
There we go. Yeah, I won't be talking about my BMI.
Do we see situations where somebody has sleep apnea and then they lose a significant amount of weight, bring their BMI down, and now their sleep apnea goes away? It's definitely it's not one of these things like gout. Once you get it, you have it forever.
No, so definitely it's a good treatment is to just start off by losing weight. So yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Okay. What other causes are we looking at?
Those are the main ones. In kids can get sleep apnea too. So people find that very unusual, but it's all because of large tonsils and adenoids. So in general, it's a bit unusual for children to snore. So if your child snores, you should be a bit suspicious about that and at least pay more attention and then listen You go outside their room with your ear or use a baby monitor and see do they have pauses in their breathing. If not, you probably need to get checked out by at least an ear, nose, and throat doctor. They can kind of give recommendations on how big the tonsils and adenoids are, and then you might
What
need to get
kind
them.
of snoring are we talking about? Are we talking about the snoring where, like my wife wakes me up and goes, "It didn't sound like you were breathing and your snoring sounds insane"? Or are we talking about even just like a, little bit of like a cat's purring and a little bit of a whistle out the
No,
nose? Is that a
with
cluster?
kids, I would say it's more like the sawing wood type thing. Like it's
Okay. They
pretty,
shouldn't have
yeah,
adult sounding
yeah.
snoring.
And I will ask that, if kids I don't see kids for sleep apnea per se, but if they're having headaches, and headaches can be a consequence of sleep apnea because of the high carbon dioxide levels that can give you headaches in the morning. Poor school performance in kids can be another kind of symptom. And sorry, we're moving a bit into symptoms, but if you have those things, you might want to be a bit suspicious. But if your spouse says that you pause, or your bed partner says you pause during sleeping, you need to be checked out. Period. End of story.
And if you call your bed partner a bed partner, I mean, I can only imagine what kind of sexy times you have in the bedroom.
Yeah, not a lot.
Come to bed, my bed partner. Anyway, are we done with the causes? Because right now it just seems like you're talking about primarily weight.
And tonsils, those are the main things. People may have structural problems with their nose or upper airway that predispose them to them, but that's probably the main one that people should be aware of.
Okay. You said we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, getting in symptoms. So let's talk about that.
Let me just add to this. And it's also important to remember that this kind of collapse of your airway can just occur to people when they get older. So it's not like, that's why it's really important to people who say, well, I'm not overweight, my BMI is fine. I don't think this applies to me. It cannot be the case. All right.
Do you recommend anyone recording themselves at night when they're sleeping? Because if you don't have a partner
I don't know.
Because you just said that if you're ever told by someone else that you're
I don't
not
know.
breathing.
I've never really thought about that. I mean, I guess it wouldn't hurt. The problem is you don't know if you're snoring, right? Or pausing your breathing. I guess you could do that. Yeah. I honestly never thought about that, but
I feel like when I wake up, if I've been snoring, I'm pretty aware of it just from a slight rawness in the back of my throat that I don't always feel. It's noticeable. And every time I feel that rawness and I ask my wife, was I snoring? There's always like, were you snoring? For God's sake.
So inconsiderate.
I guess that's a yes. Let's talk about the symptoms then. We're dipping into there. What are the symptoms of sleep apnea?
So another interesting thing is 25% of people with sleep apnea report daytime sleepiness, but that means 75% do not. Okay, so people think, oh, if it's interfering so much with my sleep, I'm probably going to be tired the next day. But not everybody does. And I had very few symptoms of daytime sleepiness. So I'm going to give you guys examples as we're going on about how this came about as a diagnosis for me. And so, yeah, I don't have a lot of daytime sleepiness. You could do something called the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, which the respirologist I saw did. And a sleep medicine specialist can be a respirologist, a breathing specialist, or a neurologist. Those are usually the two types of people who will see you for it. But I saw a respirologist. So they did a sleepiness scale. They asked you questions like, would you fall asleep in a conversation? Would you fall asleep if you were driving? Would you fall asleep in all these? I'm like, what are you talking about? No, of course not. Or in a movie, like you're sitting watching a movie or TV show lying down. Would you fall asleep? I would never do that. But the only thing I said is like, if it's a weekend and you want to have a nap, would you have a nap? Yeah, I could lie down and have a nap. I'm, usually tired from work. So I had a very low sleepiness scale, but lots of people have a very high one. The other things is the snoring we talked about, but it doesn't mean, again, just because you snore. I have a friend who has very bad snoring. He's told me his wife has complained many times about it. He wants to have sleep apnea so he can get the treatment for it. They're like, no, you have no sleep apnea. You just snore.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? So
you don't get that
one
mask handed to you. Nobody's giving you that mask for
No,
free.
I mean, yeah, I guess he could pay for it, but no. So we talked about daytime sleepiness, waking at nighttime due to a choking or gasping, right?
That is not your bed partner's hands around your neck.
A morning headache. So we talked about poor concentration, irritability. Some people have erectile dysfunction, some men. And then, like we said, your bed partners can report snoring or witness apneas. There's also atypical symptoms, which are more often reported by women. So insomnia, so difficulty sleeping, impaired memory, mood disturbance, and even bedwetting in some people. Because what happens is, it's interfering with your sleep. So you're trying to when you do get to sleep, you can fall into very deep, slow wave sleep, right? Because that's kind of the restorative sleep and you have a sleep debt that you're trying to repay. So sometimes that can happen as well. So what happened with us is, I was snoring for I didn't snore like years and years ago when I first got married, but as I've gotten older, again, you get this collapse of the upper airway. I started snoring more. My wife just put up with it. And then for about a period of time, she probably gave it at least 6 to 12 months. And she's like, listen, I can't sleep anymore because you sound like you're dying all the time. And
well,
she's like,
once your bedwetting kicked in, I'm sure it was very difficult for her to sleep, no?
so no comment. No, that didn't happen. And then she's like, it's because you're sleeping on your back. Just turn on your side and it goes away. So she pokes me in the shoulder till I turn over, and then it's fine. And it's also because for some reason over time, I just went from being a front sleeper and side sleeper to a back sleeper majority over time. So that's basically what happens. She's like, okay, you basically need to get tested for this.
But wait a second. If there is a solution, which is making a quarter turn of your body, then do you not just sort of stop worrying? And
well, the problem is like you can start off sleeping a certain way, but then you can
shift back to your back and then choke yourself out in your sleep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And there are some, we'll get to the treatment in a second, but there are some devices which aren't the first line for treatment, but where basically you could just imagine you're wearing something like a body pillow, which is or a vest which has like a shark fin on it. It doesn't, but imagine it has like a big dorsal fin on it, so it prevents you from turning onto your back.
Hilarious.
Like that is an actual device that some people have to use. But anyway,
that's the one I'm going for over the mask first.
Okay.
First, I'm going for that.
Calm down.
I'm just saying.
Yeah, Ollie was a mystery person I was talking about before who said he'd rather die.
I don't know about rather die, but yeah, I'd rather not. I mean, as it is, I have to put a retainer on my, because I grind my teeth at night.
Oh, yeah.
And you can imagine how attractive that is in the bedroom.
Huh?
Honey, going to bed now. The sleepiness scale, did you get through all the things that they measure?
Falling asleep? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they do the sleepiness scale. That's a different thing.
And do you do a sleep test as well? Did you stay overnight somewhere?
So that's the next thing. So if you're suspicious about this, then you need to do a sleep study, which is called a polysomnogram. It's called polysomnography to do it. So basically, you go to a sleep lab. There are some home tests as well. We won't get into that. I think that's a bit of a debate in terms of how accurate that is. But let's just say most people should go into a sleep lab. And they hook you up. They hook you some electrodes on your head and some straps on your body to measure your chest wall rising and falling. And, you wear comfortable clothes, you kind of change into pajama type outfit. And then they hook this all up to you. They do an oxygen saturation. They measure your carbon dioxide. And then you basically go to sleep there. So, and it takes a bit of time to fall asleep, but you end up falling asleep. You can't have any caffeine or anything for a certain period of time beforehand. It's fine. It doesn't hurt or anything. Just a bit weird to be sleeping not in your bed.
It's like a hotel.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that nice. So then halfway through the night, I got woken up by the sleep technologist. They're like, do you want to try using what's called CPAP?
I thought the sleep technologist was like, you're snoring a lot. Can you turn over on your side?
Well,
what are you doing here?
So actually, that's what they said. They said, do you want to try using the CPAP, which is a continuous positive pressure ventilation, which is the treatment for it, which we'll get to in a second. Do you want to just do a trial of that right now? I'm like, well, I'm kind of sleeping, so no, it's okay. They're like, maybe just sleep on your side. Okay.
Oh, boy.
So all this to say, I went home, and the sleep study ends around 7:30, so then I got home around 8. At 8:05, I get a phone call from the clinic. They're like, yeah, the doctor wants you to start CPAP right away. Here is a prescription. Hasn't seen me. He's like, you need to start it immediately. Okay, so let's talk a bit about, I'm going to tell you guys my results.
About the fear that you struck in the heart of this doctor. Yeah.
It never happens that a doctor calls you half an hour after whatever test you've done to tell you need to get treatment right away. So basically what the sleep study, it measures a bunch of things. It can look for restless leg syndrome. It can look for other sleep disorders as well. But in terms of this, it's looking for what are called apneas, which is near complete cessation of airflow for more than 10 seconds in sleep, or hypopneas, which are reductions in airflow by more than 30% with a similar reduction in your oxygen saturation by at least 3%, or arousals from sleep. So you can get what's called an AHI, which is an apnea-hypopnea index, which is the number of apneas or hypopneas over a certain period of time. And if you have sleep apnea you have an AHI of 5 or more events per hour, and you can diagnose someone like that. So mild obstructive sleep apnea is 5, AHI of 5, moderate is 16, and 30 or higher is severe. Do you want to
Where
guess
were
what mine
you?
was, Ali?
Was it like 100?
Not that bad.
Okay.
It was 45.
Okay.
I had 306 apneas and hypopneas overnight during this test. You want to guess the period of time I completely stopped breathing for?
Was it more than 10
12
seconds?
minutes.
What?
12 minutes. So I showed this to my friend who's
How
a
are you not
respirologist.
brain dead? Yeah, okay.
Exactly. Can you believe I'm a neurologist? And she's like, well, you don't do anything halfway. So she was like, yeah, you need to go on treatment. So interestingly, when I was on my back, my index was 48, so even higher on my back. And then non-supine, side, it's a bit hard to sleep on your stomach with all the setup on. So just say side, 3%. So definitely a big position dependent, right?
Meaning that if you went into the sleep lab and you only slept on your side the entire night,
yes, it would.
They
have
would
been
not have
normal
even
study.
recommended a sleep apnea machine.
Correct.
But you could have died the next night in your sleep because
That's true. But it's very unusual for people not to kind of move.
Okay.
You can't really control that as much. So they basically said you needed to go on this treatment. And so the treatment, like I said, is the CPAP machine. So you go in and you meet with a respiratory therapist and they'll prescribe it to you. In our province, you can get a big discount on the cost of the machine. The machine costs like several $1,000s, but you can get a discount on it if you have a sleep apnea and certain criteria met. So you get that kind of refunded to you if you have extended healthcare benefits that can pay for the rest. You have a choice of wearing a full mask or just what they call them nasal pillows. It's so nice.
Yeah.
Nasal pillows. So just a nasal mask that just goes into your nostrils.
Yep.
And it's different, by the way, than like an oxygen nasal prongs. Those are two different things. This is so what happens is it is pushing air through this machine, generates air and pushes it into your airway. So either just through your nose or your mouth and nose. And that is basically propping up your nasal passages. I'm simplifying this, but that's what it's doing, and preventing them from collapsing. That's all it's doing. Some people need CPAP for other reasons based on a problem with their lungs, but this is just supporting your upper airway, and that's it. So that's what it was. I said, I don't think I could do the mask. I think I'd feel a bit claustrophobic. Just give me the one that you think is going to be the most tolerable. They said, okay, try the nasal stuff. So I went home and set up. How long do you think it took me to get used to wearing this? Because that's a lot of people are worried about. I can't do it. I'm going to be so not used to it.
I mean, weeks at the very least, I assume.
10 seconds. Honestly, I'm not exaggerating.
Your body wanted it so badly?
Yeah. So 10 seconds, I'm like, I'll take that. And I'm like, it feels a bit weird again for the first, and you're like, oh, actually, it's okay. And then you just fall asleep. Then you say, what about my wife? Because the machine does make some noise. They try to make them, whisper quiet, but they do make some noise. I said, how you doing with the noise? She's like, it's better than you dying every night. So yeah, because she couldn't sleep because she's like, then I snored, then I would stop breathing. And she's like, what? She has to nudge me, for me to wake up. And so she couldn't sleep. She wasn't getting any sleep. She's like, yeah, now I can sleep. This is like white noise in the background and I'm fine. And I don't have to be paranoid every night that you're dying, which I essentially was. When you stop breathing for 12 minutes is not good. And so I thought it was very easy to tolerate personally. And then you probably want to know what happened. Remember, I wasn't actually that sleepy during the day, but I did find I did have some more energy over time. And you also you're not getting very good restorative sleep and you're not getting a lot of dreaming. So because you need to pass through certain stages of sleep to get to REM sleep, which is where you dream. So some people don't get a lot of REM sleep, so they just don't dream. So I didn't realize I didn't really dream for a very long time. So when you start CPAP and you finally get a normal sleep cycle, you have a dream debt that needs to be repaid.
Oh my God.
You have dreams that go on, very vivid dreams that go on hours and hours and hours. It's the craziest dreaming you'll have, aside of, I'm sure, if people took like some sort of psychedelic or something. But so you have this dream debt that gets repaid over about a month or so, and it's very interesting. God. So you knew it was doing something.
That's a dream debt. What a concept.
And then, I don't know if that's a technical term, but it's been shown before. Were
you waking up and telling your wife about all your dreams? And then she was like, you know what? How about we take off the CPAP machine? It's better without.
That didn't happen. The other thing, which is interesting, and I don't want to say this too much because I don't want to discourage people, but you actually gain a bit of weight, and I'm not sure, the respirologists know if it's when you have mild, moderate, severe apnea, you gain a bit of weight after you start to use CPAP again. And my theory for why this is, again, I could be very wrong, and I gained a bit of weight after starting using it, which is like weird because we just talked about how, if you lose weight, that's how you'll keep it off. So
Yeah.
why would you gain weight? I think it's because your body is so metabolically active trying to not die overnight. So
Very
then
interesting.
it's like, I can finally relax. And then you're not using up all that energy overnight doing it. Again, I don't know if that's true. I do know that some people will gain a bit of weight on it, like 5-10 pounds when
I
you
like your
go on
theory.
it.
As a guy who knows nothing about medicine, I like
I'm
that.
pretty sure that's it. Again, my
Yeah.
friends are respirologists, or anybody who's listening, if you think I'm wrong, or respiratory therapist, send us an email and I will
Give us
correct
a
myself.
better answer.
So that's basically my kind of story about it.
And in your case, it's sleep apnea machine for life. It's the CPAP for life. There's no.
Yeah, I mean,
Or is there a way to prop up those passages?
So very interesting question. So you can have, you can actually have a dental appliance. It's not quite as good as using a CPAP machine, but some people can use a dental appliance. They recommend that more if you have mild or moderate severe sleep apnea, not severe like I did. And that's what the doctor said when I eventually met up with him about a month or so later. He's like, you have severe, so these aren't really an options for you. People can also have surgery, which is this maxillomandibular advancement. It's a surgical procedure for highly selective patients who you can't tolerate other therapies. I have a friend who shall remain nameless. Again, I have lots of friends, like tons, who use CPAP now. And one of them is like, yeah, I just couldn't do it. Every morning I would wake up and the mask was thrown on the ground. Like when I was asleep, I would just do that. And I'm not trying to do it. I want to wear it, but it just wouldn't work. So then you have to look at other options. So then surgery's a possibility. I'll link to some review articles, one in New England Journal of Medicine, one in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. But there is, I guess, some case series which suggests there is a high rate of major complications with this surgery, up to 14%, 13 to 14%, which is quite a high, complication rate.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe reserved for specific situations. And again, a dental appliance needs to be fit by a dentist who has experience in sleep apnea. So not just any dentist, but you could use that, again, maybe for more mild cases.
What are the possible consequences if you don't treat it at all? I mean, there's death in your case, I think, was a possible consequence, but is there something short of that that's still pretty bad?
Well, the question is why, does it confer this thing other than you just not breathing at nighttime? But severe sleep apnea, which is what I had, you have a 2.6 times increased risk of having a heart attack, congestive heart failure, or just death from a cardiac cause. Your risk of ischemic stroke is higher with untreated obstructive sleep apnea, especially if you're on the more severe end, over 19 events per hour and over 25 events per hour. Remember, I had way more than that. You can get risk of heart rate problems like atrial fibrillation, hypertension that you can't treat. So you're thinking, why can we treat this hypertension? You're all on these medicines. You're getting resistant hypertension because of sleep apnea, and insulin resistance, which can lead to diabetes. So again, and there's things we don't think about either. Sleep apnea is associated with a 2 times increased risk of being in a motor vehicle accident. So something we don't think about, but again, your sleep apnea is leading to daytime sleepiness. It's an issue. By the way, speaking of that, some people are a bit worried about, I don't want to go for this study because they're going to tell me I have sleep apnea and then I can't drive. That is a worry for some people, but you only will have your license taken away if you have excessive daytime sleepiness from the sleep apnea or something very different like narcolepsy, which is a whole other different sleep disorder, which we could talk about at a different time. But if you don't have any daytime sleepiness like I didn't, then there's really no risk factors.
And they're not giving these machines out willy-nilly, right? This is very much like you have to absolutely need it before they put you on a sleep apnea
Well,
machine.
that's a very interesting question. So any degree of sleep apnea, you can go on a machine because they have found things that are most improved when you go on a CPAP machine are your sleep quality, daytime fatigue, and quality of life. Those things are all improved even in patients who have mild or moderate sleep apnea. So randomized controlled trials support the use of CPAP for quality of life. And there is ongoing research to suggest that it might improve morbidity, for example, reducing your blood pressure. There is evidence to show that using it reduces motor vehicle accidents. But does it, in all patients, reduce your cardiovascular risk? Not necessarily. it's a bit controversial in the literature. And that could be because of confounding factors, right? If you have a high BMI, then you might have diabetes, which might predispose you to having a heart attack, irregardless of whether you go in sleep apnea or not, or just as one example.
I ask also that question just because, the skeptic in me wonders about if this has turned into a racket, the way every single kid needs braces these days, as it turns out, and it's like correlated with how much insurance you have. Like, oh yeah, you should get braces. There was like 3 people in my entire class who ever had braces, and now all 4 of my kids are going to be having braces. It just feels like, I ask from that perspective.
Well, this is it. And so I don't think it's a racket in the way you're saying, but the real question is, which, to be honest with my family doctor they said, I can send you for a sleep study, but are you going to actually wear this if you have it? Because again, for mild or to moderate sleep apnea, it has to be affecting your life. So is it, making you sleepy during the day, you're not getting restful sleep, and you're willing to wear this, then maybe you should. But if you have severe, then there is a lot of these risks about cardiovascular disease, premature death, stroke, etc., that you really need to know. But the problem is, just like me, I didn't know I had severe till I did the test. I asked the average person, oh, do you think I would have severe sleep apnea? My family doctor didn't think so. Even my friend who's a respirologist probably wouldn't have guessed it. So it's just too hard to know whether you have or not. That's why I would suggest, if you have the symptoms, just go for the test. And if you're on the mild to moderate side, then maybe you don't need to do anything. But you really want to know if you're one of those severe patients, because I'm not that interested in dying, so I'd rather do what I can to try and prevent that if at all possible.
Smart. Really smart.
Really? You're not being sarcastic?
I mean, it's good to not die.
So that was our show for today. Let us know what you guys thought. Yeah, it's very interesting. So Ali talking about something that he has a lot of experience with the comedy styles, and me talking about my own personal experience with sleep apnea. Like I said, I really encourage people to get checked out if they're suspicious about it. Listen, and maybe you don't have it, then there's nothing to worry about, right? You got tested. But if you happen to be like me on the severe end, which I did not think beforehand, a lot of benefits to treatment. Let us know what you guys thought. Reach out to us, drvcomedian@gmail.com. Let us know what you guys thought. Dr. V Comedian on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We are everywhere. Ali, anything to mention for March?
Yeah, I'll be in Western Canada in a number of cities, and you can find out which cities those are in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta via my website, standupali.com. And of course, Canada Reads, I'm hoping people are reading. I've been reading.
Yeah.
Phenomenal books.
Oh, great.
Unbelievable. Great. Really a crazy collection of books. And yeah, it's going to be hard work for the panelists to discount the books that they're not championing. I think they all bring some very, very valid, not just great literature, but valid points in this idea of books that will shift your perspective. That's the theme. And yeah, they're great. Absolutely wonderful, wonderful reads so far. I've got 2 left.
Oh, great. So just in closing, remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only. They're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice, like whether you need a sleep study or not. Thanks for listening. Bye.
His voice went really high up there when he said, I'm not a doctor. Bye.